Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is Soil Treatment Centres, how viable are they? Problems and Possibilities, which will be presented by Jonathan Atkinson, who's an environmental scientist at the Environment Agency. So Jonathan has had a really varied career, from soil research projects to pollution control, before he joined the Environment Agency when it formed back in 1996. So he has experience working on risk assessments for developed closed landfill sites, landfill engineering, and environmental enforcement on permitted sites, as well as a variety of contaminated land projects. So Jonathan is also an IES council member and part of the Land Condition Community, which is an IES member-led initiative to develop IES activities for professionals working in this particular specialism. So I'll chat a little bit more about that at the end, but for now, for this webinar, as always, there'll be a chance to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So do submit them at any time during the webinar, and these will be asked on your behalf at the end. So thank you all for logging in, and I'll now hand over to Jonathan.
Hello everybody, I hope you're all safe and well at enjoying working remotely. It's a slightly strange experience, isn't it, doing these sorts of things from your own rooms, but I've seen several that have been really successful recently and had a really big audience. So, you know, hopefully in some ways it's improving connectivity between folks and helping people build networks and gain some useful CPD. It's a pleasure to be presenting today. I'll just start off by saying that these views about soil treatment facilities in the UK are very much my own. They're not a formal Environment Agency view. As an experienced officer within the EA, they're just a view that I've picked up over time, and soils treatment has always been a particular hobby horse of mine, and I'm just trying to sort of work that through, and so this presentation is very much a sort of an overview of my own personal views. Hope you could all see the screens okay. What I want to cover really is, as a waste regulator, working particularly in the contaminated land sector and wastes, particularly dealing with CD and E wastes, very much thought in line with the European principles that we should be looking at how we can reuse soils as best we can and avoid the old dig and dump scenarios. And as a regulator, I've worked quite hard developing industry partnerships and networks and ways of working, and some of you will know that I helped co-host the University of Greenwich Contaminated Land Forum soils treatment in the southeast events, which we hold once or twice a year, and they've been very successful along the lines of what I'm going to talk about today and the discussions around soil remediation on-site or off-site. But what's happened in the last 20 years? Well, certainly brownfield remediation has come to the fore as we've looked to bring derelict and disused sites back into sensible and beneficial use. And the techniques for sustainable development on those sites and sustainable remediation have come on in leaps and bounds, really. Industry groups like SAGTA and Clare and Silk and various others have encouraged innovative developments. They've been able to peer review various best practice techniques and encourage the uptake of those new techniques. And we've very much moved away from the old dig and dump scenario to more and more clever in situ and on-site treatments to sort of achieve the benefits that we want with the timescales that developers have. But certainly we have found that quite a bit of a challenge from a regulatory point of view. And over the years, we've worked with industry to try and develop modern regulatory light touch approaches. Things like the mobile treatment permits, which now exist with their deployment forms that are done for each specific site. The development of various quality protocols, and indeed the definition of waste code of practice, which industry developed off the back of the old EA definition of waste code of practice for greenfield and brownfield sites. So there's been some useful work done over time, but there are still some challenges. We used to, in terms of soils treatment, certainly in England and Wales, have relevant exemptions for soil manufacturing sites. But we were finding quite a few problems with those: poor practice, inappropriate use of wastes, very little control perhaps about some of the material quality, and materials miraculously becoming products from waste materials without reaching a full end of waste status. So the exemption 13s disappeared. We then had permitted sites under standard rules or bespoke permits. And again, unfortunately, our experience is site practice is a bit variable. and there's often records of incoming waste that aren't perhaps quite complete, and classification and testing not comprehensive enough to fully understand the materials coming from different source sites and what those materials may be. And poor materials management on some of those sites have led to some contaminated and materials, coexisting, as it were, and maybe some poorly verified low quality outputs. In fact, we had an inquiry last week from somebody who bought a bag of topsoil from some business, and they'd inappropriately used our logo, saying that they were a permitted site allowed to produce topsoil. And the guy was basically complaining that the material that he got out of his bag was full of bits of glass and other miscellaneous sundries, which he didn't feel appropriate that the EA should be supporting. Well, we weren't, and that's the sort of poor performer that we are trying to crack down on. So that particular business will be getting a visit once we've sorted out how we can do that safely under the current circumstances. But these are the sorts of things which have meant good practice is really been undercut by poor performers, or indeed illegal site operations, and that's left us a problem to some extent with the quality protocols and the definition of waste code of practice approach. More of that soon. I think early on with those soil treatment facilities that grew up in the early 2000s, most of them at the front end of landfill sites, certainly there was quite a benefit to some of these, and some of those early pioneers in commercial soil recycling, such as Biogenie and others, DEC up north, established some really good sites that were on the front end of landfills, and treated soils had their hazards reduced and were enabled to be used for various engineering activities on the landfill sites. And that was a really helpful way to go forward, and the gate prices were relevant. I think post-2008, when we had that last hard hit on the economic issues, something to think about going forwards perhaps, that impacted how development took place, and people were looking to sort of funding cuts and so on and so forth that made life difficult for some of us. And some of those impacts of that financial slump are still evident today, I think, in terms of managing project development risks and how those are now contracts managed, with perhaps, sort of the lump sum taking over and the lowest bidder perhaps getting some of the work that undercuts those who are using best practice approaches. As I said earlier, we've tried to develop modern regulatory approaches to sort of reduce red tape, as it's known. Certainly the initiatives such as the definition of waste code of practice and the development of standard rules permitting for various activities have helped that permitting process, or sort of pseudo-permitting process. And there's been a proliferation of use in the number of developers, contractors and waste producers who are using environmental permits, recovery permits, disposal permits, relevant exemptions, and these aligned codes of practice. So the options available for processing of soils have grown quite a lot since 2005. But unfortunately, in an environment with perhaps less active regulation, due to resources being both local authorities, planning authorities, environmental health officers, and indeed ourselves in the Environment Agency in terms of overall supervision of some of those projects. And tracking the quality and the end of waste status of some of these materials has been somewhat difficult, although we have had some significant campaigns to sort of look at some of those activities, and those are ongoing at the moment. And developments of new ways of working with partner organisations are coming to the fore. However, if we sort of take our eyes off the UK for a moment and look across the water, we do find that big soil treatment facilities can actually be very successful. And I had the opportunity many years ago to go around the DEC site in Antwerp, and some of the sort of capacity and activities there that were going on to treat soils and produce a material that was suitable for engineering works in highways works were quite significant. Key issues they have for that success over there, I think, are they have a very clear legislative base and a legislative base for reuse of materials. They know the inputs of materials from source sites because those source sites are fully characterised. They've got very good on-site materials tracking in place so that materials move from stockpile to treatment to stockpile very carefully and all recorded properly. They've got sufficient space for stockpiling and treatment zones. They understand the output criteria for the specified end uses in their legislation for materials that can be used for engineering works. And they've got verifiable outputs that have got a really good sampling data process to back them up. And that space is one of the key issues, I think. And they have resources for good regulation. Coming back to the UK, unfortunately, that's not the same experience we've had. A lot of sites have incoming loads that are really insufficiently qualified, maybe a bit mixed. There's very poor materials tracking throughout the site. Stockpiles tend to get sort of intermixed because there's no dividing barriers or facilities. Sometimes you get entrainment from hazardous substances, from trommel fines, or broken ACMs from demolition work and screening. And they're really the ones that we have in the UK are pretty much more just a simple segregation and physical treatment process rather than the sorts of activity that we see over the water. Even some of the mixing of suitable soils with green waste materials has not been particularly good, and some materials that are called products when they come out of these sites have used non-PAS 100 composts and mixture of materials going into them from the soils fractions, which basically mean you've still got a waste material, even though a lot of them are called products, and people taking those products may be taking a fairly big risk, perhaps. So poor quality and not meeting quality protocols fully, or certainly not the formal end of waste that we have procedures for. Those quality protocols are useful and important, and they can provide sites with an opportunity to recover material, and indeed we support the use of secondary aggregates. But they do have to be fully compliant with the quality protocols, and a lot of people don't seem to read the fine print, and the sites are not operated and have the relevant documentation to prove to an end user that they actually have got a quality protocol aggregate or some of the other quality protocols that are also relevant. Under DoWCOP, there's been a lot of use of DoWCOP, and very beneficially, I think, particularly on contaminated sites where materials reuse has been under risk-based process, and that's helped the sustainability and also the social and economic effects of moving away from dig and dump to reusing materials on site. And I think in those contexts, DoWCOP has been very successful, along with the planning process that goes with it, with the proper site investigations and remediation strategies and verification plans and reports. And providing the DoWCOP's followed in full, then we've had some really good use of it, some really good examples of it. Unfortunately, we are aware that particularly with some of the direct transfer materials that are taking place, that perhaps it's not always followed in full, and the materials aren't always fully compliant with the aspects that the code requires. There's other regulatory position statements, like the current topsoil position statement for manufactured topsoil. And again, all well and good when it's used properly and all the requirements are met. But too often the requirements aren't met, and therefore the topsoil is still a waste, and people are taking outputs from those sites which are perhaps a bit dodgy in terms of their quality. Now, all of those mean that there are other issues to consider. So if you've still got a waste material and you're depositing materials that have come without a formal end of waste process of one kind or another, then there are now, since April 2018, associated risks related to landfill tax and fines for illegal deposits or inappropriate deposits. Things like the use of DoWCOP has an exemption from those taxes, but only if it's followed in full. So people who are not using it appropriately might be struggling to totally fall away from that potential liability that there is. So they need to make sure that they understand the landfill tax implications if you're using materials that aren't fully compliant. Just looking at that, obviously development sites are passing surplus materials on or importing surplus materials, importing aggregates for piling mats or sub-base, for instance. If you're not dealing with a fully compliant material that's compliant with the quality protocol or definition of waste code of practice, potentially you've got a deposit that might be liable for landfill tax. Demolition contractors who are sort of selling crushed material out into the open market as a 6F2 or something or other, is it fully compliant with the quality protocol? if people are receiving that material, have they seen all the relevant documentation that shows that it is compliant? Soil manufacturing sites that are basically waste transfer stations, segregating some materials and using soil products and sending them out as products. Are they really products? Are they really end of waste? Hauliers moving materials need to consider where they're taking materials from and to, and what their liabilities may be. And certainly remediation contractors who are reusing materials on the site of origin make sure that they comply with the relevant remediation strategy in full, and you've got the data to prove it. Or be careful if you're receiving materials from other sites that you have the data to prove the provenance of the materials that you want to use. Because obviously if you knowingly cause or facilitate a disposal, then there could be issues related to environmental regulations, and we need to be careful about that. And certainly for the landfill tax, there's a joint several liability issue which people need to think very carefully about what they might be involving themselves with if they're taking ownership of a site or using a site or taking materials from sites. So what are the options for soils and stones under the Definition of Waste Code of Practice version 2 at the moment? And that's one of the areas that we're reviewing with Claire currently, is to try and bring forward changes to make version 2 more compliant with the current legislation and previous court cases. It's work in progress. But yes, we have formally agreed hub and cluster sites, but they do have to be formally agreed with the Environment Agency, and they can only be specific to agreed donor and receiver sites where a permit is involved on one or other of those sites. And they must all be covered by relevant planning permission. For fixed permit sites that are trying to use the hub and cluster process, then that's very much a case of the materials processing and tracking. And we expect those sites to only be agreed on a hub and cluster process basis if the materials are kept completely separate from other waste streams that the fixed site might be handling in its permit area. So very, very difficult. And to be honest with you, those hub and cluster projects have not been particularly common because the time frames for different projects and different donor sites and receiver sites have not always found to fit, or there's been space issues for ensuring separate tracking of the materials on fixed sites. So generally very careful, and you need to be careful about the outputs from soil treatment facilities as to whether they are acceptable or not, whether they have reached formal end of waste. A lot of soil treatment facilities are processing materials into what they call products, but there is no formal end of waste agreement to those processes, and you can't use DoWCOP to take materials from general soil treatment facilities. The only option at the moment for those is if they're producing a topsoil that's compliant with the regulatory position statement on topsoils from soil treatment sites. So that's a bit of a fly through of the past experience, from poor exemptions to permits that aren't always compliant, and we need to start looking at those in a bit more detail. I think it's not just a regulatory responsibility. I think if industry wants to keep some of these lighter touch regulatory approaches, it's down to industry to self-police itself to some extent, and try and help overall the industry and partnership work to promote better practice on some of these sites. Certainly Definition of Waste Code of Practice has come into the spotlight a little bit due to some poor performers under the existing arrangements, and they've rather spoilt the picture for some in that respect. There's options perhaps to extend things, but at the moment, given the past performance, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll be looking to cut red tape further. And certainly the review of quality protocols and definition of waste that's currently underway may well tighten up some of those areas rather than release any further flexibility. However, as I said, looking over the water to Europe and looking at how their legislation works, maybe there's some changes in legislation as we move through the Brexit process, and we can follow some of our own rules but learn from their experience, maybe find new ways of working. The Grand Bank scheme over in Belgium as an example, and maybe we could follow some of those good practice examples to get where we want to go. It can be done. We've seen it done very well on the Olympic site, which was a really complex project. Logistically, a lot of materials moving around through two soil treatment areas, one for the north, one for the south. Total number of huge amount of material cleaned up and reused on site with excellent tracking and sampling protocols. And that made that whole thing a success. and the Olympic site was the end result of a real mixture of dirty sites from different uses over the past 50 to 100 years. So it can be done, and that's the way we would look to go forward in the future, perhaps. But that's somewhat in industry's hands, as I've indicated, improving performance, working better with regulators, increasing the available options for modern regulatory approaches if we can get better practice as the norm, improving how materials are classified and how materials are traced and tracked, improvement of the record keeping processes, and certainly verification processes to confirm what your output materials actually are, looking at the quality of both soils input into the process and also coming out of the processes that we talked about. Key thing is making sure that we meet the Waste Framework Directive objectives, and again we're looking to reduce the amount of waste that goes to dig and dump. Although working with minerals and waste planning authorities, obviously with large holes in the ground from mineral extraction, there is still very much a place for landfill disposal, particularly for inert wastes of certain types, and the quantity of waste we have coming out of developments, particularly in the southeast, for instance, where we have large basement digs, perhaps in London clay. That material's got to go somewhere. It can be beneficially reused if there's a project that's open and viable at the time, and we've seen some good work done on that in the past, but some difficulties with it as well. So where we go forward is interesting. And as I say, another key thing to think about is the financial side of this stuff, and whether there are, since 2018, perhaps some new financial liabilities for improper use of materials across the board. So that's the challenge. How do we work together to ensure that we can create sustainable, good quality, reusable materials from our brownfield site developments particularly, and our demolition projects? Or do we end up with what we've had in the last couple of weeks notified to us, where somebody's taken the opportunity while there's been the lockdown on to dump a whole load of poorly processed construction and demolition waste on a developer's site that was locked up during the lockdown, and they've now got 100 lorry loads of material that has to be shifted off their site before they can proceed with development once lockdown finishes. So really difficult for some folk to apparently sort of step up. But that's the challenge. So that's me done. Hope you've enjoyed that, and hope it's